Recently, the World Bank published a report called Swimming in Sands to High and Sustainable Growth. As the name suggests, the report categorically looks into the economic problems of Pakistan and their sustainable solutions. Profit recently interviewed Gonzalo Varela, who's an economist at the World Bank's Islamabad office and is also one of the authors of this report. To start off with, we talk about productivity. As per the report, there's major distortions that come in the way of increasing productivity within Pakistan. What is the three-step model that the report suggests, and what are the salient features for it to remove those distortions?
So to go into how do you remove the distortions to increase productivity, I think we need to take one step back and see how is it that distortions are affecting productivity. And the way that we show in the report that distortions are affecting productivity is in various ways. So if you want, in several layers, right? So when a firm or an agent in the economy makes a decision of what to do with its resources, it's affected by the incentives it faces. So the first set of incentives is what is the tax policy. And what tax policy does in Pakistan is it discourages investments in dynamic tradable sectors and encourages investments in real estate. Why? Because the taxes on income from property, from land ownership or property ownership are much lower than the taxes on income from productive activities, say in manufacturing or in dynamic modern tradable services. So what that does is it basically induces agents to invest more in real estate and less in dynamic tradable services. A first solution there would be to ensure that tax policy taxes income from different economic activities in a more homogeneous ways. So increase taxes on real estate, increase property taxes, so that you don't have that ill incentive at play. So that would be a first layer of removing distortions, making sure that income tax or profit tax across different sectors is relatively homogeneous, and that will require stepping in the area of property tax, in the area of taxing land, and also taxing agricultural income. So that is a first layer of distortions. But there is a second layer of distortion. So let me explain what this second layer of distortions do, and then how do you remove these distortions. The second layer of distortions have to do with the fact that the little investment that goes into dynamic tradable sectors like manufacturing or like modern services faces yet one more layer of policies that end up allocating resources in a way that is not optimal for the economy. And this has to do with the way trade policy works. So trade policy is designed to encourage import substitution. And encouraging import substitution has an unintended consequence, that is discouraging exports. So when policymakers introduce policies to substitute imports, what they are implicitly doing, and perhaps unintendedly so, is substituting exports. Why is that? Because what import substitution policies, the form import substitution policies in Pakistan have taken, is having high import duties to protect domestic producers from import competition. That protection then has guided a lot of investors in the manufacturing sector or in the modern services sectors to produce for the domestic market, because in the domestic market, you're protected from import competition with high tariffs, and that protection from import competition gives you an incentive, gives you extra profits if you focus on the domestic market. Those that choose to export don't benefit from the extra profits that the high import duties provide. So that distortion of high import duties, what it does is that the little investment that goes into manufacturing ends up into inward-looking manufacturing. So how do you fix that? Well, the way to fix that is to gradually reduce import duties. So to gradually move away from that mindset of import substitution, which will allow gradually also moving into an export-led model of growth. Now, the challenge with reducing import duties is that import duties, yes, protect against imports. So that creates these incentives for firms to produce for inward-looking activities. But import duties also create or bring in tax revenue. So when you have a government that needs tax revenues to finance its expenditures, and in the case of Pakistan, a government that has systematically run fiscal deficits, every extra rupee of tax revenue is valuable. So removing this distortion, in this case, reducing import duties, has the problem that you need to collect revenues from somewhere else. So what we are proposing here is, think about two things. First of all, take advantage of reducing import duties when the exchange rate or the domestic currency has depreciated. Why? Because that depreciation gives you a natural protection for the domestic manufacturers, because the cheaper rupee means that the dollar is more expensive, means that imports are more expensive. So that gives you a natural shelter from import competition. So that's your opportunity to reduce import duties then without fearing a flood of imports. But then on the revenue side, you will need to compensate with extra revenues from somewhere else. From where? Well, the first order will be, as I mentioned before, increasing taxes on property, increasing taxes on income from land, increasing taxes on agricultural income. But secondly, also gradually move away from arbitrary exemptions that are given on import duties to specific firms. The tariff code or the customs code in Pakistan has something that is called the fifth schedule. It is basically a list of exemptions granted to specific firms when they import materials, when they import intermediates, or when they import capital equipment. It grants them an exemption of the import duty that they were supposed to pay.
The report also goes into the detail of problems with the availability of credit and the utilization of fiscal space to crowd in private investments. What are the steps that you propose that the government takes to ensure these objectives?
That's a very good question. So one of the things that we see in the report, and this links to what we were saying before, right? So firms don't grow. And firms and the aspect we just focused in the previous question was, okay, the size dependent policies. It's not just about size dependent policies. Firms also don't grow for various reasons. An important one is credit. If to grow, to scale up, in general, you're going to need some sort of credit. If you have a good project that is that it will allow you to duplicate your sales in the next 5 years, let's say, then you should be able to finance it in a healthy financial market. You should be able to finance it with independence of how many retained earnings you have today. But if there's no credit available, the only way you can finance a project is to use your own retained earnings. And that limits the capacity of firms to grow. So firms with good ideas but no return earnings yet are not going to be able to grow if they don't access credit. So this highlights the importance of credit markets, the importance of the financial sector to facilitate this process of firms' growth. What you see in Pakistan is that the government is the dominant player in the financial sector. And the reason why the government is the dominant player is because it has very large financing needs. So it has perennial fiscal deficits that are not just persistent, they're also large. And so it relies on the banking system to finance these fiscal deficits. That means that banks use most of their liquidity to lend to the public sector. In economics, that we would call that there is crowding out of private sector activity. So because the government does many things and ends up with a large fiscal deficit, this large fiscal deficit displaces private sector activity because it uses a lot of resources that the financial sector has. It borrows a lot from the financial sector. And so there's little for the private sector to borrow to conduct their own investments. So that crowds out the private sector. So large government deficits tend to crowd out the investment of the private sector. So a way of ensuring that more private firms have access to credit is introducing more fiscal discipline in the central government, so that fiscal deficit gradually falls, and so the financial sector, the banking sector in Pakistan ends up lending more to private firms. So that is a first order condition for this to happen. You need fiscal discipline so that you have crowding in rather than crowding out. So you need a lean government that invests in the areas where it should invest, but doesn't incur large losses or spends inefficiently and ends up with a large fiscal deficit. So that lean government with investments where public investments should be will crowd in rather than crowd out private investment.
There's an almost paradoxical relation between carrying out reforms and having a lean fiscal side. Those in power argue that to have reforms, we need to have higher fiscal resources, and to have those resources, we need to tax those already under the tax net, whether directly or indirectly. What are your thoughts about that?
I do not see that trade-off that clearly. So let me put it this way: it is true that countries at lower levels of development rely much more on taxes on international trade, for example, because they're easy to collect. And as you develop, as you grow, your capabilities also grow, including your capabilities to collect better taxes, right? And that's why countries, as they develop, as they move up that development ladder, they move into different type of taxes that, they collect more on income tax, they collect more on excises, etc. So there's an element of capabilities I'm not denying. But given the level of development of Pakistan, there is a lot of space to collect more and better. The example I was giving you before is a case in point. So Pakistan gives a lot of exemptions on customs duties that are quite arbitrary and are for inward-looking firms. Those are not aligned with international good practices. And actually, it would be straightforward from a collection point of view, from the complexity of collection, right, to gradually phase out those exemptions. So that has nothing to do with, you don't need to invest a lot in sophisticated systems to be able to collect that. You just need to remove those exemptions or think very carefully if those exemptions make sense. And that is going to give you a lot of additional revenues. Then when it comes to property tax, it's true that what typically is said is that officially transactions are done at a certain value, but actually in practice transactions are done at a higher value, and so there's that space for tax evasion. There are technological solutions to this, and as technology has evolved and as ICT technologies have evolved, governments across the world have done much better in reducing this sort of tax evasion mechanisms. So technologies are available out there. Many countries are doing it. So why not Pakistan?
On the subject of import restriction and import substitution, do you think there's an alternative to the current administrative measures that the State Bank of Pakistan has in place to restrict imports? If there is, how would that work in the current economic circumstances of Pakistan, considering that these circumstances are very extreme?
The situation is complex at the time. The situation is extremely complex when it comes to the need to preserve scarce foreign exchange. Now, the challenge with these current policies is that there are two challenges. One has to do with the fact that you're trying to save foreign exchange, but by limiting the ability of firms to import spare parts or machinery, you're further limiting the foreign exchange inflows from the export side. So you're hurting exporters. So you could have a system in which you insulate exporters from uh, this type of restrictions. And this is something that we saw, for example, in Sri Lanka. So in Sri Lanka, with a similar challenge in terms of foreign exchange being extremely scarce at some point in time, exporters were preserved from restrictions because whatever they were importing to add value and export more. So in terms of net foreign exchange, at that current juncture, that those import flows were actually leading to more exports. And so in terms of net foreign exchange, you will see an inflow. So ensuring you're insulating exporters from these measures, right, is crucial. The second element that I want to mention is that if the government is going to keep the restrictions for imports in the form of, for example, restricting the issuances of letters of credit or increasing cash margins, etc. The important thing here is to be extremely transparent about what the procedure is and what the rules are. And so it's a distortive policy, no doubts about that. But when you have more transparency and if you have rules, then exporters, yes, inward-oriented firms, no, or this type of spare part, yes, this type, no. That makes that sort of reduces the extent of the distortion. If instead what you have is a system that is not transparent, and some firms do get the letter of credit, some firms do not, then that creates a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is not good news for investment, and therefore is not good news for growth. That is a recipe for rent seeking, and that is a recipe for stagnation.
Since we're running out of time, it was the International Women's Day a few days ago, and a large chunk of the report talks about the female labor force participation in Pakistan and how that is a problem. Can you shed some light on that as well?
This is a big issue for Pakistan. It's a big issue for Pakistan because the educational attainment of women have increased substantially over the decades. So women have been getting more and more and more education, and yet female labor force participation hasn't been increasing. So what you have there is sort of a mismatch. So it's a waste of talent, right? So you're not tapping into all of your talent. We estimate that to cost almost up to a quarter of GDP. So if Pakistan's female labor force participation numbers were to match those of Bangladesh, country with similar cultural background, you would be adding to your GDP up to 23%. That's not a small number, right? Now, what to do? So this is a complex issue. And I don't think there is a silver bullet to fix it, right? But what we do see in the data is the following. We see that women, as you know, poor women tend to work. And they tend to work because they're also located in the farm. And working in the farm is acceptable from a social norm point of view. You're not far away from home. You're sort of working at home, right? So home-based workers. The issue is as you move down the income ladder of the household, or the education level of the household, which are two things that are very correlated, then you see a U-shaped relationship. As you grow, as your income grows, then women participate less, and then at the top of the distribution, really educated or women in much richer households, then they work a little bit more. But that U-shape sort of disappears when you separate districts that have low connectivity and districts that have high connectivity. And why is that? Well, what that is showing us is that when you live in districts with good connectivity, it's not just the internet connectivity, it's also the transport connectivity. Then it's easier for women to move and go to factories or go to work. So those that want to do it. lack of transport infrastructure is a big deterrent, and particularly lack of safe transport is a big deterrent for female participation in the labor force. So there are many things that yet we don't know, but there are some certain things that we do know. We do know that daycare matters. We do know that safe transport matters. So public investments in ensuring that the transport is available, that transport is safe, particularly in relatively large cities, is going to be crucial to make a contribution in this area. There are many other things, and I invite you to read the report because we are suggesting a number of other initiatives and interventions to increase female labor force participation. But I would say, given the time restriction that we have, that safe transport is a crucial element, and it's an element that is in the domain of public policy.